Canadian-Israeli journalist who is visiting the U.S. on his Netanyahu's New Normal speaking tour. Well, he'll be speaking at Emory University and Spelman College November 13th and 14th here in Atlanta. He'll also be speaking at UCLA and Scripps College on the 15th and the 16th of November. David has lived in Israel for the past 15 years and regularly writes about racism in Israeli society and has been quite critical of the Israeli government's policies over the years. Here's part of a lecture David gave at the University of Arizona.
Netanyahu realizes that he can actually turn it into political capital. He boasts about it, in fact. He's advertising this fact in a series of tweets. He writes, "A strong Israel prevents the passage of masses of refugees to Europe." He writes after Trump announces that he's going to build his wall, he says, "President Trump is right. I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. Great success. Great idea." Now, in Israel, Netanyahu is not only building a wall to prevent other Africans from entering the country, he's also trying to round all those Africans that already exist in the country into camps. And sickeningly, the attacks on Africans aren't confined to African adults. We're talking about now acts on African children, African babies. When you look at these photos, any baby, definitely these cute babies, how could you possibly have any hate in your heart towards them? But, as we heard earlier in the introduction, there's a hatred of African babies just as there's a hatred of Palestinian babies. They represent a demographic threat. And so we have Israelis walking through downtown liberal Tel Aviv with condoms. And they walk up to areas of Tel Aviv in which African people live. And they walk up to African folks and they try to hand them condoms. They try to give them condoms and convince them to use it. We don't want you to have kids. We don't want you here, and we don't want your progeny here. We want you gone, and we won't want you to recreate yourself.
So David, thanks for joining us here in the studio. I want to start off with a lawsuit, or at least reference the lawsuits that you're party to. You're being sued for libel by former Israeli General Israel Ziv. And the Canadian journalist for Free Expression wrote the following. He said, investigations by the United Nations revealed that Kiir permitted soldiers under his command to commit mass rape against women and children. Transcripts obtained by Channel 2 detail how Ziv and his team proposed rehabilitating Kiir's reputation by bringing a victim of rape to the UN General Assembly so that Kiir could blame such war crimes on indigenous African tribal culture. Now, having said that, I don't want us to go into the actual lawsuit itself, but could you tell our audience about the limits of free speech in Israel in general, and what happens to those people who criticize Israeli government policies and what's happening more broadly?
Sure. Well, in my case, it's just one example of many of how people, of course, journalists, especially independent journalists, and all kinds of truth tellers or whistleblowers are being attacked by the government. Mainly, it's most often manifested in efforts to delegitimize them, to say these people are traitors or race traitors, and that's their motive for speaking out against the policies of the government or the actions of the government. In the cases of journalists, there's all kinds of journalists who've been sued. It's not only myself, some of them by government officials. Netanyahu himself sued a journalist and one, other ministers as well. Oh yeah. And look, in the Israeli landscape, you have some groups that speak out against human rights violations. But in the Israeli society, there's incitement against them. The government will say, these people are not just persona non grata. Not only are we going to say you're not part of civil society, but for example, this past year when the German foreign minister came to the country and met not only with Israeli government officials, but also with Israeli human rights groups. Netanyahu canceled his meeting. He was so offended, saying, if you speak to Israeli human rights groups, you're beyond the pale, and we're even willing to risk a diplomatic incident over this. That's to the extent that there's a hatred towards human rights groups or anyone who speaks out. So yes, hitting us in our pocket, delegitimizing us in terms of domestically, but also foreign.
Yeah.
and increasingly so.
You know, as you mentioned that, that brings my attention to the standard talking point here in the United States, that we have no closer ally than Israel, and particularly we refer to them as the democracy, the single democracy in that region. But you can't help but notice the tension there between referring to Israel in this manner, but there seems to be sweeping crackdowns on speech that's critical of the government. But here in the United States, speech that's critical to the government is a fundamental part of our democracy. Could you speak to the tension there, where we see Israel as this burgeoning, not burgeoning, but just a full-fledged democracy, yet there's a crackdown on freedom of speech, particularly where there's criticisms of the government?
Well, okay. There is a massive disparity in the way that Israel is portrayed in the Western media and the American media, and what it actually looks like for people living there on the ground. Okay, one thing I will say for the U.S., you know, with all its problems, that what you just mentioned about freedom of speech being paramount, that's something we can say to its credit. In Israel, it isn't that way at all. Now, of course, you know, we've been speaking about the difficulties of truth tellers or people who speak out, but again, these are all people that I've been discussing for the most part are, you know, have Jewish privilege, have that privilege to be able to speak out. Yes, we're coming under great scrutiny and great criticism, but that's nothing compared to what non-Jewish people experience in the country. And therein really lies the crux of it. Because the tension between Jewish and democratic, you know, this is the tagline or the motto of the state, of the country, so to speak. And this is where it falls apart. In my analysis, Israel is not what you'd call a democracy. We'd say it's an ethnocracy, meaning that it's not a country where rights are doled out to people based on their citizenship or based on their residency. No, in Israel, it's based on your ethnicity. That's why we call it an ethnocracy. If you have the right ethnicity, then you get all the rights. If you are not of the right ethnicity, you don't. You have some subset of rights that's less than those of the Jewish ethnicity. And this is the problem, because any way you state it, if the country is, there's nothing wrong, of course, with countries celebrating holidays, having days off on certain days of the week or certain holidays, and celebrating its many cultures and the culture of the majority and the culture of the minority. But the problem is when you fuse that, and when you give the state a specific cultural characteristic, by definition, you're giving the people from that culture more rights.
Right.
And it's not by accident. You know, the government and all the governments have done this. Not, you know, it's not accidental. It's on purpose, because they see it as their raison d'être to give Jewish people citizenship plus extra citizenship.
I want to talk about that conflict between referring to it as a Jewish state and a democracy. But before we get to that part, you've spoken extensively about racism in Israel today. The U.S. State Department's 2016 Human Rights Report detailed what it refers to as institutional and societal discrimination in what appears to be a separate and unequal society where two classes of citizens in things such as housing, employment, and where exists two classes of citizens in things such as housing, employment, and education. Do you agree with that characterization, and would you expand on that more broadly?
Sure, sure. Without a doubt. Look, there's dozens of laws on the books that discriminate between Jewish people and non-Jewish people.
Right.
Some of them are mild, and some of them are felt on people's life experiences. And of course, besides the legal discrimination, there's also de facto discrimination, where there's no law in the book, but lower-level functionaries take it on themselves to discriminate. So I'll give you an example. There's towns all across the country where they just don't allow Arab people to enter their public pools.
Wow.
Now, you wouldn't think of that happening in 2017, yet that's the fact. Also in Israel, just just off the cuff, we're talking about in schools. 99% of schools in Israel are still segregated by race or religion. Here in the United States, you had the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, if I recall correctly.
Yes, sir.
So, it's been over half a century since you've had to even debate, should there be or shouldn't there be segregation?
And this just goes without saying there. 99%. That definitely goes without saying.
Yeah.
I mean, to circle back to what you're referring to is the tension between the Jewish state and democracy. you started to mention what that meant for, in real terms, for individuals who are not Jewish. And then you're casting this almost parallel to the discrimination in the United States. Would speak on interracial marriage then in that region.
Yeah, it's something that I've reported on a lot, something that bothers me a lot. Again, you'd have to go back to the Loving versus Virginia case here in the U.S. It's been half a century since people even thought it was necessary to define the right of people to marry anyone, regardless of race. Of course, we're still debating in this country and in some other countries whether you can have same-sex marriage.
Right.
But that, you can't even have different race marriage or different religion marriage. In Israel, the only marriages that are permitted are people of the same religion, two Jewish people or two Muslim people. Again, that's not accidental. It's very much purposeful because, sadly, many people up top do not want racial integration.
Yeah.
They want to keep people separated. Now, yes, there are different loopholes. You can get around it. You can fly to the U.S. right here, go to Atlanta City Hall and get married and fly back, if you got the money. So it's essentially a tax on interracial marriage. But more so, even more problematic is the government. Several ministries of the government spend millions of shekels or millions of dollars every year to fund groups that are anti-miscegenation groups, the local version of the KKK, and they move from West Bank's Jewish-only settlements to those few towns in Israel where you actually have Jews and Arabs living together, moving into those neighborhoods in order to incite racism, in order to break people up, in order to cause discord, and prevent interracial, interreligious marriages, if you can imagine.
I'm almost taken aback by that part right there. Like, I mean, we discuss those tensions pretty regularly here on our show, but I've never heard that. That's beyond the pale. You've also, you have this analysis that you describe as the four sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Expand on that for our audience.
Sure. Yeah, of course, we often, we hear it being described as there's Israelis and there's Palestinians, there are Jews and Arabs, and those are the two sides. I think it's more helpful or instructive if we kind of broaden our analysis and we say there's four sides, and those four sides make up the word side, like a mnemonic device, S-I-D-E. So briefly, S is segregation. People who want two separate states, Jewish state of Israel, Arab state of Palestine, that's segregation. Then there's I for integration, people who want one democratic state. No borders or boundaries, everyone has equal rights, integration. Then we got domination. Again, no borders or boundaries, but it's essentially an apartheid state where one group dominates the other. That's where we are today, for all intents and purposes. And sadly, what we see now is the rise of the elimination camp, and those want to eliminate those of the other ethnic group, or actually ethnically cleanse them or genocide them to kick them all out so you have racially pure states. And they are now actually a faction of the government. So the domination camp is the most dominant, and then the elimination camp is quickly joining them. I floored you.
Yeah, twice in one interview you floored me. So where most of us in America may think the domination camp, would you put Netanyahu in that camp?
Yeah, certainly.
And we would think that was the epitome, but there's one step further. Actual elimination.
Yeah, and what you see in recent months is that the people, let's say 25 years ago, if someone would have said that, they would have been considered still beyond the pale. But we see that the normalization of those ideas that's happened in recent decades, where now members of the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, for example, openly speaks about this kind of ethnic cleansing plan, and proudly so. The slogan of that party going into last elections was "No more apologizing." So that's where we are. The mask is dropping. There's no more efforts to conceal the rhetoric in a liberal discourse.
We're almost out of time, but is there a counterforce? There's almost like the pendulum here in any group of body politic, where you see the extreme, but then there's a swing back, almost like a revulsion too. Or do you see that the more the extermination or the elimination group gains power, they're incorporated into the government? Do you see any type of backlash pushing back against it?
I wish I could say that that's the case. I don't see it. In the last 20 years at least, we see progression further and further to the far right. Yeah, and inside the country, as I said, the people who do speak against those forces are not just delegitimized, but demonized, you know, spoken of as traitors. Of course, you would hope perhaps that some pressure would come from the outside.
Right.
Unfortunately, the Zionist lobby is so powerful that if anyone even speaks out to criticize what's happening on the ground, they are immediately inundated with, you know, vicious attacks of, oh, you're not saying this because you care about human rights, you're saying this because you hate Jewish people. Well, it's of course a little bit less effective when the person criticizing is actually Jewish or actually Israeli, but still, that's where we are today. In fact, the majority of the Zionist lobby here in the U.S. is actually Christian fundamentalist. They're supporting a Jewish state of Israel for their own reasons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always interesting. And I mean, we're over time already, but that's always a fascinating thing to me is that the reasons that you have a Christian Zionist support is fundamentally at odds with the long-term life of Israel, but
or just Jewish people.
Jewish people in general.
Yeah.
But that lobby, that faction is widely accepted, it seems like, particularly with the Netanyahu wing of Israel. Speaking of that, though, how do Israelis feel, and I know we can't speak categorically, but how do they feel about Donald Trump and that right-wing support of Israel?
It's sad to say this, but there was a poll that was recently done by Pew, and they found that of all, you know, they asked people all over the world, what do you think of the American presidency since Obama's left office and Trump has entered? And there's only 2 countries in the world where its citizens feel that the presidency has improved. And those 2 countries are Russia and Israel.
Wow.
So that's
terrifying notion.
Yeah. I mean, look, the government has, it's true, there is a, you know, the government just recently, the press was downgraded in terms of, is the press free in Israel? That was recently downgraded because people are realizing one of the biggest newspapers is controlled by Sheldon Adelson, American financier, who's Netanyahu's biggest supporter. The other one, Netanyahu is now accused of colluding with him to arrange positive coverage in exchange for, you know, favors. So when 85% of the press is in his pocket, what do you expect? People are more likely to, and frankly, it's an issue of privilege. You know, when it's not, you know, Frederick Douglass said, you know, people, and others have said this, you know, people don't often give up their privileges without a contrary force. And so, just like in South Africa, unfortunately, I have to make this comparison, but, you know, it was only through confrontation and only, you know, the people said, okay, I'm willing to give up my privileges and continue to live as equals in the same country with all the rest of the people living here. Hopefully, we can come to that place where our brothers and sisters, like right here in the U.S., can say to us, hey, y'all are doing wrong, you need to get correct, and then it could be cool. But we don't have that yet because our brothers and sisters are tongue-tied, you know, being battered by bullies who are saying to them, you know, you're demonizing the most democratic state in the galaxy. So, you know.
Which we've established in this conversation alone, is that is fundamentally
far from it.
Far from
to
it.
say the least.
David, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure to be here.
Love to have
Thanks
you
for
back.
having me.
We'll be back right after this.